All right, so in the spirit of lightning, we have about 8 hours of content on the broad topic of IP and property in VR, and we have 45 minutes. So we're going to do a very quick self-introduction and then jump right in. I'm Mark Lemley. I teach here at Stanford Law School and run the program in Law Science and Technology.
I'm Michael Rutherford. I'm Northern Cheyenne, Dakota, and I'm a PhD student at McGill, a longtime VR nerd.
Hi, everyone. I'm Micaela Mantegna, an affiliate at the University of San Andres in Argentina, and also at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, and a TED Fellow.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Lee. I'm an assistant professor of law at the University of New Hampshire School of Law, and I'm also an affiliated fellow at the Yale Law School Information Society Project.
Right, and we have no slides, so there will be a giant picture of Britain, I think, above us. All right, so I want to jump in with, so we're talking about property and intellectual property in VR, and I want to jump in by sort of asking the broadest philosophical question. Can't we just get away from all of that? I mean, property is about regulating and modulating scarcity, right? Intellectual property is kind of about recreating artificial scarcity to try to make things look more like real property. But we've now got a world where we can create an unlimited amount of property. Shouldn't this just all be free and open to everyone, Micaela?
It's a difficult task to talk about intellectual property at lunch, because I feel like it's like the hardest topic to talk at this moment. So I will start with something, those who know me know that I'm such a nerd, so I will start with something really lightly. If you remember Star Trek, which is kind of the pioneer series talking about the future of humanity without scarcity, they had this apparatus that was called the replicator, that you can put any single thing and they can replicate that and it will give it back to you. It seems like magical technology, but at the same time, we are now dealing at our present moment with digital technologies that can allow us to do that. We can think about digital technologies as abundance technologies. We have seen this in the last year when we were talking about generative AI and the expansion of generative AI in terms of art and how it creates such a different amount of works. And the thing is, as Mark was saying, intellectual property is, the standpoint is moving from a framework or a mindset of scarcity, that intellectual works takes a lot of work to create, so we kind of compensate, depending on which philosophical theory you adhere to, we compensate the author for that effort, and we allowed like a limited rights to that for a certain period of time. But now we are entering a time when these assumptions are being challenged by these technologies, because we can create a lot of works in a single, really, really short time framework. I don't know how many of you have tried OpenAI, DALL-E, or Midjourney, and the amount of artworks that you can create, and also what I like to call like the Turing test of the arts or the Colton test, is like a lot of them, they can really be thought as being created by humans. If you show that to people that is not in this environment, they can be fooled into thinking that there was a human artist behind of that. So for me, what is interesting is like we are at the same point seeing a lot of these technologies with 3D printing and generative AI, but we are trying to create NFTs and replicate, yet again, artificial scarcity. And this impacts what I don't know if you are familiar, because this is something that gets more niche from people from intellectual property, with the concept of the negative spaces of intellectual property. Because one of the assumptions is that you have to compensate authors for them to create. But the things that we are seeing, and this is also true for TikTok and the content creation economy, that the economic driving is not the only motivation for creation. So we need to move from that mindset and start rethinking that. And how is intellectual property equipped to reframe this debate? And also, I would like to just put it on the table so we can move the discussion. But going into the metaverse, for me, is thinking about the metaverse as an evolution of capitalism, where we can have this these two opposite views, a view of a technology of abundance, where everyone can access these spaces and create anything from these blocks, but at the same time, we have the corporate need of continuing selling us goods, and also the challenges that come with that about how we define intellectual digital property, and how are we going to deal with first sale. We are going to talk a bit more about that.
Well, all right, so great, we've got a replicator, right? That seems like a great thing. We'd like to have a replicator in the real world. Maybe we now have an AI replicator that will generate any kind of art we want, any kind of text we want, anything we want. That's good, right? Problem solved. We don't need IP anymore.
Thank you.
Michael, should I be concerned about this? Replicating anything I want?
Yeah, I'm not going to address topics I have can't speak on. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have the background. But I am an active member in my community, indigenous communities, Northern Cheyenne, Lakota. And one thing we face in the IP space is a lack of intellectual property rights protection. So what we're talking about is potentially this space where we have, in the virtual space, infinite replication capabilities, and no one is being remunerated in the traditional ways. That exists now for indigenous communities. We have now, you can go on Amazon.com, not to pick on them, go to eBay, Etsy, and you can find a whole host of fake indigenous artwork. And none of that is very cheap, maybe pennies to the dollar compared to what it actually takes. You know, you have artisans in the real world crafting. My father does this, he's a silversmith. My mother does this for leather work. And they know, they're in their 60s, nearly 70s, they're not XR experts, but they know intuitively that every time they create a new artwork, someone's going to replicate it. They make something, they make small batches, maybe a dozen pieces a year, and they can expect that within 6 months, there's going to be a factory in China reproducing it because it's highly commercialized. And I foresee that happening in the XR space. And in a particularly aggressive way from these generative art mechanisms like these. Right now, there's open source generative art AI, Stable Diffusion. You can go in there and say, create new art from DALL-E, which is cool. I'm sure the estate of DALL-E probably has an opinion on that, you know, because it's still within copyright. There's also, you can do that for living artists. You can write an essay in the voice of the professor over here, and we were playing with that last night, and it's reasonably convincing, right? And so we're facing this world where human behaviors and human-derived work can be replicated seamlessly with AI in XR. Like right now, I was just now playing with last night and a couple days ago. You can use Stable Diffusion, this art generator, to create the virtual spaces. So you can say, create a teepee village, and they'll create a virtual, it's very rudimentary right now, but you can create 3D virtual space of a Lakota teepee village. And imagine that this technology is going to be in a year, where we're going to be able to replicate the art with saying, I want to see a building generated by the professor over here with his articles on the wall, you know, and the AI.
Who doesn't want that, really?
Exactly, yeah. Esoteric, but you know, you could get it if you wanted. And we're facing that reality now without some sort of IP controls that don't even exist in the real space.
Right, and so one of the interesting things I think about this is that the sort of availability of all of this creativity, and not just for cheap, as Michael talks about with the sort of replication in China of actual physical objects, but then as we move into the metaverse, right, or digital content, right, essentially for free, right, the ability to automatically generate any kind of text, any kind of art, 3D spaces, fundamentally changes the economics, right? But that could be good or bad, right? I mean, it's probably really good for consumers, right? I kind of like the fact that I can have whatever I want made for me instantaneously for free. My wife's an artist, right? She might not feel excited about the idea that she's competing with free. But we've seen similar things happen in the internet, right? And one of the things I think we've learned is that things change and it is a disruptive technology, but people also find a way to make money from it. Right, and I guess one question is what that will be. Another question, I guess, is whether the AI itself is an author, right? We're creating all of these new things. We do have a legal infrastructure, right? Copyright law that says, oh, we'll provide protections to these things. Are we going to say that the AI's works are copyrighted? Are we going to put them in the public domain? Is it free to, if I generate something, am I the copyright owner? Is the software the copyright owner? I don't know. Michaela, Tiffany?
So I think this is a great conversation already, and I am fully prepared to not talk about any of the other topics we prepared. So I am really interested in this idea of the post-scarcity world because I am also a Star Trek fan, as I'm guessing are maybe like 90% of this room, right? Yeah, are Star Trek fans?
Thank you.
Okay, very few actually for a nerdy conference. I'm disappointed. But I'm totally on board with this. The issue I find is that we're not there yet, right? We're not in the post-scarcity world. And I think there are two resources that are really scarce. One is environmental resources. So cloud computing is a huge cost center, right? AI is a huge cost, right? Energy, water, power, just the land. There's been interesting research on things like, noise pollution near large data centers, right? Huge environmental costs, costs to people as well. So this is a resource, a type of resource that we have to think about, right? If we're considering more VR, more XR, more property, that's a limited resource. The other limited resource, of course, is in a capitalist society, which we will be in for quite a while, it's money, right? And I think I would love this idea of the post-scarcity world where we are motivated not economically, but by creativity or reputation or something to create art, but we're not there yet. It's like what Michael was saying, I think really concerns me a little bit. And I'm not, a copyright maximalist or anything, but I do think that there's got to be some sort of balance. It's amazing we can use these new tools to create, new virtual environments or to create property within virtual environments. But then I'm also concerned about, until we get to the Star Trek world, right, how do we protect the creators along the way, right, especially the traditionally marginalized creators who generally don't get economically incentivized to continue creating. So that's kind of where I'm at. How do we get to that world, which I think is the ideal for IP or just all of us generally?
I think if I can follow up to that, I think it's a great question because it forces us to talk a bit about, and I would add a third element of this, is that another scarce element is attention. Because the humans are now like the single point and that we're trying to get not only money, but their attention, and that's what is kind of moving the internet economy these days. But what I'm thinking is that generative AI comes with a specific subset of problems that haven't been solved when we're talking about AI ethics. So we are talking about creators' appropriation. We are talking about representation. We are talking about basically training your replacement. Because now I have been doing research, I had to do this disclosure, I have been doing research on this for the past 5 to 6 years. I have been talking a lot with artists, and there was this kind of, let's say, assumption that AI was never going to be as good as an artist. So every time I went to a conference and I was like talking about what was coming, was like this, I don't know, it's maybe human ego that AI is not going to be as good as an artist. And now fast forward to past year, and artists was kind of like the digital artists and the traditional artists were standing in arms, in Twitter, in other spaces, shouting at each other that you are ripping off artists by using generative AI. Others are saying, no, this is like the evolution and we are advancing the medium. But the thing is, in this equation is who is reaping the benefits from this? Because when two users, where their data has been used to train these systems, get opposed to the new users that are reaping the benefits from that, what we are missing in this equation is who is at the top of the pyramid getting the money from that. So it's a problem about the redistribution of that. And I agree that we are not there yet to think about a post-scarcity world. And I love the book from Manu Sadia that's called Trekonomics, that talks about the economy of Star Trek and how we can think about different economic models. But also, I think that the problem runs deeper, and maybe we are seeing it now like more, because it's more visual. But this problem circles back to the AI ethic problems that we haven't solved yet about how kind of replacing work without creating meaningful new forms of shops to people to get money from that.
I think it's a reasonable concern, although I think I'm the optimist on this panel when it comes to this. When I hear the concern, right, I can't help but think of sort of echoes of hundreds of years of prior concerns, right, of people whose jobs are displaced by new technology. And those concerns are real, and those people do, in fact, get displaced, right? But the world almost invariably turns out to benefit far more, right, from that new technology, right? The people who were throwing their shoes into the machines in the 1830s, right, because they didn't want hand labor, child labor working 80 hours a week to be replaced by these automated machines, because how would they get paid, had a point. But I'm glad we're not living in that world anymore, right? And so I think one of the things about the move from a scarcity world to an abundance world, right, is it's scary for people who are kind of established in the scarcity world, right, who kind of have a way of making a living, right? And it's scary doubly, I guess, because we don't understand, we haven't yet developed an economics for thinking about, right, what an abundance world looks like. We've built an economic system around scarcity. And then when intellectual property became more and more important, right, when creative output became more and more important, and it wasn't automatically scarce, we basically created a legal infrastructure to make it scarce, right? Because we understood scarcity, we understood how to get paid, we understood the money. And so I mean, that is not to sort of downplay any of these concerns, but one of the things I do want to raise, and I think it's a transition to the next questions we wanted to talk about, is our experience with intellectual property, I think, has largely not been the people who will benefit from it are the indigenous artisans, right, and the small creators and everyone else, right? The money does not, in fact, generally in intellectual property flow to those people, right? It flows to the large corporations who end up with the power. And so one of my worries is whether, far from kind of a utopian or dystopian shift to an abundance society, right, we're really shifting to a world in which the rights that we currently have in the physical world are all going to be disappearing. They're all going to be contingent on the whim of the company. So maybe can we talk a little bit about the move to sort of everything licensed and revocable at will? I think we've seen this in the video game context, right? I spend a lot of time on money on Roblox, right, or buying up property in Second Life or whatever else, but with the notable exception of Second Life, which was an outlier in this, all the terms of service say, you don't actually own anything here. We don't care how much you paid for it. We don't care that we gave it to you. We don't care that you've had it for years. We don't care that you made it yourself. Everything on this is actually owned by the company. It could disappear at any time for any reason, and you have no recourse. Is that the world we're heading towards? Right, a world where there is no kind of continued ownership of anything?
Well, even in the optimistic, as the rest of the panel views the abundant society, that in its form is sort of a form of hegemony, because if you think about why would it be abundant, why do we have these generative AIs? It's because what they've done is scraped all of our data. They contain 200 terabytes of images from the public internet. If you've ever put your picture, every human who's ever put their picture on the internet through social media or websites has their image in this data set. And so what's going on here, this abundance that's being created, is through exploitation. And so you have to start considering these questions in terms of who's being exploited. And so in terms of indigenous knowledge, our knowledge is being exploited because it looks pretty, it's marketable. We have traditional knowledge from India being patented. These are traditional strategies that have been done for thousands of years. And the WTO actually does have an opinion on this through their WIPO, or also their TRIPS, their trade-related aspects of intellectual property council. And so then going back to your point of everyone having access to everything, the extreme copyleft is exploitation of us, the minorities, who want to have the handcrafted work, versus the siloed corporate, the corporate silos, going to Disneyland and existing only in the Disney reality and being able to not really have any ownership of, like, I'm sure if they could, they'd probably take IP rights of you taking selfies within Disney. And that's what would happen within these confined worlds of the metasphere. So either extreme is bad, in my opinion.
I like to throw a concept about digital obsolescence. Because when we are thinking about digital goods, we need to take a step back and think how digital goods are different from tangible goods. How are we seeing what some people is calling the end of ownership? Because everything we had in the tangible world, for example, a book, you can lend it, you can throw it away, you can gift it, you can resell it, but that's not true for digital goods because they are regulated by a different subset of rights and a different framework. In one hand, you have property rights. In the other hand, you have intellectual property. And in the physical world, in the tangible world, there is something that's called first sale principle, that when you buy a book, you can do all these things that allows to create these secondary markets, like reselling the book or gifting it. But of course, you cannot create an exact copy and profit from that. But that's not true about the digital goods. So we are at the whim of communities disappearing, and this is something coming from the video game world. How are we talking about, because despite from the old discussions about if video games are art, video games are not only art, but are also mediums of creating communities and people to find each other and create these very meaningful relationships. And what happens when that server is not profitable anymore and someone decides to shut down that community? So it's like we need to think about it not only in terms of property, but also in the terms of how this is impacting society. And we need, this is something that is still has not been solved by courts, and of course, copyright laws are different in different countries, in each country. So how are we going to think about the first sale principle and the digital obsolescence in this world? Are we going to apply the same principle that we have from tangible goods and set aside intellectual property regulation? Are we going to make stronger consumer protection laws, saying that you should have more rights to that ebook, to that movie that you acquired? You are not just lending that in that terms. So for me, this is something that we should bring into the discussion about the metaverse and the future of XR, because even if in one hand we have this capacity of creating content at will, and the other, the terms of services of those services, if we are thinking about this inherent tension on the metaverse between centralization and decentralization and who is going to own the resources of that, this is really, really tied with the concept of legal interoperability, because everyone's talking about how are we going to port content from one world to another. For example, you have a sword in some video game world, you want to use that in other video game world. Are we going to have like something that change that content and creates it and adapts it to the aesthetics and to the values and the economics of that new world that you are carrying that item with? But the thing is, even if we can solve technical interoperability and we can kind of find a way of recreating the function, the looks of that object, that digital object in another new medium, we still have to solve the legal interoperability, the contracts put in place to be able to take that thing from one place to the other. And if we are not going to do that, we will end up like having silos of content where you are moving from, I like to say like little customs when you step in the border from one metaverse or from one environment to the other, and you're going to be strip search and leave everything behind before you enter the new world.
And that in turn means that sort of whatever metaverse we devote our time and energy to, right, has essentially total control over our lives there. Tiffany, are you?
Yeah, no, this is fascinating. I think a few years ago, I got really worried about this concept of living in the Facebook world, And now they've trademarked Meta, so we're getting there. I don't, for any of you who are working at Meta, apologies for always using Facebook as the main example, but I think that is a concern, right? I am concerned about entering a technologically mediated reality if that technological mediation is always proprietary, right? It's always Facebook or Google or someone. And I think interoperability, like you mentioned, is something that will happen. Like, we're going to have standards, we're going to make it so if we get to the world in which we are using VR as part of real life, as our last speaker said, we're going to get there. But I think that's a really interesting point that I actually didn't think about, this difference between legal and technical interoperability. Because I could definitely see something like, what is it called, the Unicode Consortium, right? For how we display emoji on our phones. I can see something like that. But to do that for all types of virtual property would be just an immense undertaking. And I'm not sure how, I'm not a standards person. I think we have a panel on standards later on how that would take place. But I do think it's doable because we've done it already.
And so one of the things that's interesting to note there, right, is, and maybe on this I'm less optimistic, right, that it will happen just because I've watched the world move from the internet of 30 years ago, where we had actually built interoperability successfully into both the technology and the legal sphere, right, in the last 15 years into a world that is essentially controlled by walled gardens, right? And that wasn't done, right, sort of through nefarious government action, right? It was done because it was a lot more convenient to use your Apple phone for various things, and Apple, and to a lesser extent Google, sort of locked down what could come in and out of that phone for some combination of good and selfish reasons. And so I guess I worry that I would like to see us move to a world, we have a opportunity here at the sort of dawn of VR, right, as we sort of build this system out to decide what the architecture looks like, right? And that's a social question, but it's far from inevitable that it's going to be an open, interoperable architecture. It could be, I hope it will be, but walled gardens are a very real possibility to me. All right, I want to switch focus a little bit and talk about the role of intellectual property inside VR. Because one of the sort of real benefits of and characteristics of VR, right, is your ability to be somebody else, to build whatever you want, to sort of do the things that are impossible in the real world, right? So you could be I could be an avatar that looked like me, but why would I want to be an avatar that looked like me, right? I could be when I could be Aloy or Wednesday Addams or who knows, right? But of course, some of those people are, real people, and they might object to me looking like them. Some of those people are fictional characters, and their corporate owners might object to me looking like them. And I think we're going to see a similar problem with brands too, right? Trademark owners are going to object if I decide to be a Marvel or a Disney character, right? Disney might have something to say about that. Am I free to do it? I mean, I'm not selling my product here. I'm just being an avatar who happens to look like a Disney character.
I can start. So I think there is a lot of these traditional IP concepts we can transport to VR, right? Whether we want to or not, it's going to happen because there's so much money in there at stake right now. So brands are going to be upset, right? If you make yourself into the McDonald's Hamburglar, right? And then you start doing a lot of nefarious acts in a virtual reality. McDonald's is not going to be happy about this. And then we can say, well, what can they do, right? And what I think might happen is that brands and companies and people will look to the sort of similar copyright or trademark takedown process we see with online content, but in a virtual space. So they might say, someone is misusing my logo or something, right? They've created this little, virtual house that looks like a McDonald's, but it's not McDonald's, and people are being confused and going in thinking it's us, right? Destroying our reputation. So I want this taken down. Probably something similar to what we do already right now in traditional IP and also digital IP. I think it's a little more concerning, though, when you think about this as a virtual reality. So if I were to, build a house that looks like McDonald's, right? And then I'd get a cease and desist letter from McDonald's and probably have to, renovate my house and so on. Is this the same thing as being forced to redesign my virtual house in virtual reality? And if it's not, what's the difference there? One difference I see is that in reality, this would be probably a court-based battle, right? And then I would have to eventually get this taken down. It might take years depending on how combative I want to be with McDonald's. But in the virtual world, if it's a Facebook-owned metaverse virtual world, Facebook can just delete my house. And so we get back to that same question, I think, which is a little bit concerning, which if we port the traditional IP concepts into VR, but it's a mediated VR owned by someone else, that takedown process becomes scary. It's even scary if it's your avatar. If Mark wants to be Wednesday Addams, and he's been Wednesday Addams for years and years, and then he gets deleted, what does that even mean?
Yep. Well, right, and I think we're going to see other problems, right? So it might turn out that I'm not the only one walking around who looks like Wednesday Addams, right? It's a popular character, right? So there are confusion-related issues. And trademark law and the right of publicity to some extent are designed to deal with actual instances of confusion, right? If I show up pretending to be someone else, right, or pretending to represent a company, and I make misrepresentations or I say things and people think that the company is saying them, then the company or the individual might be hurt by that. But I do think one of the things we've seen in the analogous context of video games, right, is that both individuals and corporations are surprisingly aggressive in trying to say not just don't confuse people into thinking that you're me, but don't do anything that sort of includes my trademark, includes my image, even in circumstances where you're doing it not to confuse people, but to sort of make an accurate representation, right? So don't depict NBA stars in a basketball video game about NBA stars. Don't depict their tattoos accurately, because that's copyright infringement, maybe. Don't depict the image of college football players in your game about college football players. Don't depict their number or their weight and height. That takes the right of publicity somehow. And so I think there's a sense in which kind of the benefits of virtual reality, right, that you can kind of create and be whatever you want to be, are going to bump up against the legal constraints of a bunch of people who don't want you to be something that is them or reminds people of them or is too similar to them.
Yeah, please. Oh, maybe real quick. So what about, I don't know the specific details. Take the Seattle Seahawks. They have a logo that's based upon an indigenous design. What about that case where they become, suppose in a theoretical reality, they become very aggressive about any kind of depiction of a Seattle Seahawk, which is based upon an indigenous design that has existed for thousands of years? What about in that scenario where you have the community who has legitimate access to it, or at least because of time and history, that's their design effectively, but now you have a large corporate entity who wants to protect their IP.
I think there is a long tradition in intellectual property law of companies appropriating concepts from somebody else and then saying, but nobody gets to appropriate it from us, right? It stops here. Okay.
Absolutely. Disney has made a history about that, taking every single thing from mythology and culture. Full disclosure, I already say that I am a nerd, so I'm going to solidify that, but who knows here what cosplay is? Okay, nice, nice. Do you know how many cases, because one of the things when we are talking about avatars, and for me it's like, it reminds me to cosplay, and it reminds me to fan fiction, it reminds me to modding. A lot of things, we already have answers to that. Do you know how many cases of legal disputes about cosplay have been? No? 0. Or let's say 1. But do you know who is the one that made that cease and desist letter? The maker of a rag, this is a long story, but if you go to DragonCon, there is this is a convention, a huge convention from fellow nerds, and there is contests of costumes, and one of them is like using the historic pattern of the rag in the hall of the hotel and creating costumes that incorporate that pattern. The only case of a cease and desist letter around cosplay was made by the maker of that carpet. So no company was crazy to sue their own fans. And that is also a shift that for me connects when we were talking about the negative spaces of IP and how do you engage your brands. Because we are thinking as lawyers from that perspective of intellectual property, but you need to think about reputation and how your fans engage with your brand. And this is something I read lately that for me is like super smart. We were talking about Disney, how Disney have been protected about Mickey Mouse. And on the other hand, how many of you have seen the Minions lately everywhere? Yes? Because that was a brand decision of allowing people to get the Minions around with that content, even with some uses that might be questionable. So it's a new way of engaging with your IP. And also, do you know that, for example, video game publishers, when they launch a video game, they hire cosplayers to create the costumes for that game, and they sometimes give cosplayers guides, precise guides of the characters in advance to the community so they can recreate that character. Which could be, and for a lot of people, it's like, okay, this is clearly an IP infringement. But for me, it's like, how do you benefit from that engagement? And this is something I wrote an article in 2017 about streaming and how video game publishers allowing streaming created two industries.
Some do and some don't. And
no, but yeah.
Well, but this is part of the problem, and
yeah.
it may be that everybody in the cosplay industry is kind of cognizant of the fact that this is going to benefit them. It may be that it just flies under the radar screen. But I wish it were true that people weren't dumb enough to sue their own customers, right? And over and over again in intellectual property, we learn that it's not true, right? And people in fan fiction have learned this to their detriment. But I think you see it in many contexts. And part of the answer is maybe it differs by company, right? Some video game companies are perfectly happy to have you go build mods, right, on their video games, right? But not Nintendo. No. Nintendo will come after you like a ton of bricks, right? And so one of the things that I think we need to think about as we go into the VR environment, right, is we have some affordances that just come from the fact that either we don't rise to the level of anybody's radar screen or some subset of people are willing to sort of figure this is not going to be terrible for me. But I think that particularly if we end up on a few large-scale VR platforms, right, or one kind of cross-platform metaverse, I worry that that's not going to be true. I worry that the companies are going to say, hey, wait a minute, no, I don't want any depictions of my company here. And I think that's going to be even more true when those depictions are things they don't like. Right, and the cosplays are in general homage, right, and good. But we're going to see, and I think we've already started to see in AR, right, people who deface trademarks, deface brands and stores in an AR, right? I don't actually spray paint graffiti on it, but if you're wearing the AR headset, you can see it. Or you walk through a mall, and I create an AR app that for each store that goes through will show you, here are the working conditions of the people who made the clothes or the products that are being sold there. The stores don't want you to see that, right? And they're going to say, hey, wait a minute, right? You're changing the appearance of my trademark. You're changing the appearance of my brand. I should be able to control that. And I think that's one of the issues we're going to face. Concluding thoughts. I know we're running out of time.
No, well, go ahead. You go.
Totally different track. One thing I'm also concerned about is this idea of what property you create in the virtual world. So obviously we have these, parallels with video games and online, right? You create a dance, in Fortnite or something. What does that mean? Who can own that? But also things like, what about, I was just speaking to, remind me your name? Brendan, about eye tracking. Like, what about the eye tracking data? What about if we were to do any sort of, some of you work on brain-computer interfaces, the data from that, the user data. Is any of that some sort of intellectual property of the person who is using whatever technology has been developed to mediate our experience? So I would love to think about this as well as a form of IP. Our interactions, sort of in line with what Michaela was saying about the virtual space as a community. What about that community? I don't want someone to own, my interactions in a community.
Yeah, and I guess maybe my closing thought would be to kind of circle back, and when we really think about abundance, it's for us. And we're in the elevated 1% of humanity, and because we are Westerners, and so when you speak about Star Trek, I cringe a little bit because they have a ton of episodes where they just pretend Native Americans in their episodes. And it's a Western perspective on what utopia is, and it excludes the rest of 90% of humanity on the world and other cultures. Not all of us want to invade every single planet in the world with our perfect replicators. But because that's a perspective of Western white male, and literally a Westerner. Gene Roddenberry made Westerns, so basically it's Westerns in space. And so you think about what is abundance, what are the value systems that decide what you're deciding as abundance, and how are you deriving the actual material, the loam, the granite, and the foundations of your abundance, and how they're exploitative of people. Because when you're looking at these generative AIs, they're scanning the artworks of my uncle, Francis Yellow, and he makes beautiful art. You go in there and say, you can go onto DALL-E, do Stable Diffusion. I'm not picking on any particular AI, they just scan the internet, but they're basically stealing his ability to have voice in the way he wants to have voice, and we're calling that abundance for us, the users of XR, the users of AI. He's not a user of AI. We have these traditional knowledge keepers, and this is happening across all the world. And so I would ask you as the IP people and the policymakers, we have time, because XR hasn't taken off yet, to start really thinking about what does abundance mean and how this abundance is being derived and the exploitation that we're doing right now to create this abundance.
And for me, going in line with that thoughts about abundance is we need to think about scalability, because we were talking about the volume and the velocity in which AI can produce works. And we didn't get time to get to the authorship question, but this is something that is still ongoing. There is still no resolution about that. And for me, the other question is, what is going to happen with the public domain? Because if we have these extensive terms of protection for these works, and we end up affording these, the same terms of 70, 50, 100 years to works created by AI, and particularly with the centralization of that into these corporations, because today they are, the copyright problem is solved through terms of service, assigning you commercial rights to the things you are creating, but not is solved in profundity. So what will happen when everything that you can create it's going to resemble something that AI created before? Where is the open space for humanity for creation that? So for me, one important relevant point for this debate is how will we envision the public domain moving forward?
And so I guess the last thing I'll say is, right, there's a version of abundance that's, right, what Michael calls the Western version, right? Produce all the stuff, all the consumer goods you want for free, right? But I think there's a meta version of abundance, right, that VR makes possible, which is precisely that we can have an endless variety of different communities that coexist, right, in a world in which we aren't limited by the constraints of physical space, of money, of the scarcity that we have had to deal with in the past. And if there's a hopeful view for VR, for me, that's it, right? Everybody gets the society they want to live in without having to take it away from someone else. All right, thank you all for your attention.